What's up guys, Asian here again with another theory crafting video, and today we're going to be going over penetration and how penetration works, where you can get it, and just how much penetration is equal to how much additional damage that you deal. So we commonly hear a lot of things like this is the penetration you need, this is the penetration you want to have, how do you optimize your penetration, things like that. So I figured I'd cover all that today, just so you guys can get a more clear idea about how penetration exactly works in the game. This is going to be mostly geared towards stamina, however I will be covering some things from Magicka as well. I'll swap over to my Sork to show you guys kind of the options for penetration to get penetration on a Magicka tune. So just starting off here with the very basics. Each PvE mob has a different amount of resistances. So overland mobs have resistances equal to 9,100, and dungeon and trials mobs and bosses all have resistances of 18,200. Now, if you guys have watched my resistances video, we know that 660 resistances is equal to 1% mitigation, so that value does carry over to penetration as well as PvE resistances. So at 18,200 resistances, basically what that means is the boss is able to resist, at least for dungeons and trial bosses, they're able to resist about 27.5% of the incoming damage. So you're actually dealing 27.5% less damage than you would if you had absolutely no penetration at all. Now this isn't the case. Your base penetration is actually 100, so you're going a little bit more than 27.5% if you don't have any penetration at all, but clearly that is something that you're going to need to try to overcome in order to get the most out of your DPS. So in terms of penetration to percentage increase, it's basically the same thing as resistances. 660 additional penetration is equal to 1% additional damage dealt, or I should say 1% less damage mitigated by the boss. So for something like that gives you a certain amount of penetration, all you gotta do is divide that by 660, and that's how much additional damage that the boss is unable to mitigate, or is removed from it. So I already told you that the base penetration is 100, but there's plenty of other ways to get additional penetration. So first we're just going to be taking a look at how stamina can get penetration. So the first thing that you're going to want to be aware of is that there are selfish stamina sets and there are also group debuff sets. So I'm going to be going over the group debuff sets first, and then I'll be talking about the more selfish penetration sets. So the first set that we have here is Sunderflame. The 5-piece effect: when you deal damage to fully charged heavy attack, you deal an additional X amount of flame damage and reduces the enemy's physical resistances by 3,440 for 8 seconds. So notice that it says reduces the enemy's physical resistance, not increase your physical penetration. So that's kind of what you want to differentiate when you're looking at sets. So when it says reduce the enemy's physical resistances, that benefits everybody in the group because that's a debuff on the boss, not a buff to yourself. That's a very important distinction between group debuff sets and more selfish penetration sets. So most trials groups, if they have multiple stamina users, will have one in Night Mother's Gaze and one in Sunderflame. Night Mother's Gaze is the other group debuff set. Let's see if I can find it here. When you deal critical damage, you reduce the enemy's physical resistance by 2580 for 6 seconds. So that you see both of these sets reduce the enemy's physical resistances. That's basically the same thing as saying you're increasing your own penetration by that amount. But instead of increasing your penetration, it's a debuff on the enemy, so it affects everybody around you. So now this is physical resistance, so it doesn't benefit your Magicka DPS. That's spell resistance specifically. But typically, when you have a trials group with 2 or more stamina DPS, you have these two sets up because these two sets combined provide a greater overall debuff than what the 2 other selfish sets that I'm going to be talking about next can provide you. So I don't believe I have them on my stand BK right now, but I might have a couple of pieces in my bank. So the first set we're going to be talking about is here. There's Two-Fanged Snake. So with the 5-piece, when you deal damage, your physical penetration is increased by 830 for 3 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. The gold value is 860. So that when you stack that 5 times, that gives you 4,300 additional physical penetration. Now, like I said earlier, this is physical penetration, not reducing enemies' physical resistances. So this only buffs yourself. It does not buff anybody else in the group because it is not a debuff on the boss. So Two-Fanged Snake is one of those more selfish sets because it only affects your DPS, not your buddy's DPS. So this set is only really used for things like dungeons where you don't necessarily have the luxury of having an additional stamina DPS, or if you are the only stamina DPS in your trials group, this is a good set to use as well. But like I said earlier, if you do have two stamina DPS in any group, Thunderflame and Night Mother's Gaze combined will give you a larger penetration or larger physical resistance debuff than the penetration that you get from Twice Fanged Snake. I believe it ends up being about 6,000 a debuff on the boss when you have Thunderflame and Night Mother's Gaze up compared to the 4,300 from Gold Two-Fanged Snake. So that's something you want to consider when you're thinking about gearing out your stamina DPS for trials. Now the other set, I don't know if I have a piece of this in my bank right now, it might be on a different tune. Okay, so I don't have it here, but the other penetration set is Spriggans, and that gives you, I believe it's around 3.5 thousand physical penetration. So that's a slightly weaker set compared to Two-Fanged Snake. However, you don't need to stack it multiple times. It's pretty much a flat increase to your physical penetration. So that's kind of the advantage of Spriggans, but at the same time, it's still a selfish set. It only boosts your own physical penetration and doesn't debuff the boss, so it only affects your DPS, not the group's DPS. Now, outside of sets, you have a couple of skills to use that, or debuffs, I should say, that increase your, or at least debuff the boss, which is an effective increase to your penetration. So the first one is obviously going to be your Major Fracture, which reduces the boss's physical resistances by 50 to 80. So if we do the math, divide that by 660, that amounts to an additional 8% reduction in their mitigation ability. So there are a couple of sources for this. Noxious Breath is one, Surprise Attack on Stamina Nightblades is the other, but the most common source of Major Fracture is going to be coming from your tank when they use Pierce Armor or Ransack. That automatically applies Major Fracture. Now there is another debuff, Minor Fracture, that can stack with Major Fracture. The only source for Minor Fracture at this point right now comes from two abilities. The first one is going to be coming from Snipe. There is a morph of Snipe that applies Minor Fracture. It's obviously not used very much, if at all, in endgame trials, so you're not going to see that very often. The other sort of Minor Fracture comes from Templars. Templars have an ability under, I believe it is Restoring Light, called Power of the Light. It is a morph of one of their base skills, and that applies Minor Fracture. So if you have a Stamplar in group, that's normally their job to make sure they have Power of the Light up as often as possible in order to have Minor Fracture. So that decreases the enemy's resistances by 13 to 20. Those are the two main sources of Minor Fracture. You can get Minor Fracture out of poisons, but that's kind of a loss in DPS for you, and it doesn't actually linger on the enemy for very long compared to Power of the Light, because poisons do have an internal cooldown that you have to play around with, but Power of the Light, you can pretty much keep it up 100% of the time, depending on your rotation. There is another source to increase your physical penetration, and that comes from your CP. So go over to the ritual here. Piercing is the CP passive that increases your physical penetration. If we quickly redistribute our points here, it maxes out at 5280 at 100 points. Obviously, the more points you put in, the lower, the less increase that you see. So you can see our jump from 0 to 10 gives us 1,000. However, when we jump from 50 to 60, it only increases by 500. So you kind of don't want to put too many points into piercing, because you do get diminishing returns, and as well as you still have all those debuff sets and physical penetration debuffs like Major Fracture that you want to take into consideration while you're maintaining your CP. So stamina optimization is pretty important in Trials group if you have more than one stamina DPS. So like I said earlier, you're always going to have two running Thunderflame and Night Mother's Gaze. Sometimes that will be one DPS that's running both sets. And then normally there's also another set that people use, which is let's see, Morag Tong, which increases the amount of damage that you deal with your poison damage. That is an optional set. Most stamina DPS groups will just use Thunder and Night Mothers, and Morag Tong is just kind of icing on the cake there. And then obviously you try to get a Stamplar with Minor Fracture for with Power of the Light. And then your tank will be providing all the other sources of penetration. So your tank will be providing Major Fracture. The tank will also be providing Crusher. Let me see if I can find it here. here. Crusher, this is an infused Crusher, which decreases resistances by 2108. This is both physical and spell, so this benefits both stamina and magicka users. The base is 1644, and if you have a Torag's Crusher, it boosts it up even further to, I believe, 2740 is the debuff that you get from Crusher. Plus, you also get the added benefit of Alkosh's proc, which decreases physical and spell resistance by 3010. Again, that benefits both stam and magicka, so that's another source of penetration that you can also consider when you're trying to figure out your CP distribution. Now, do keep in mind that some of these are kind of limited in uptime, especially Alkosh. Alkosh is particularly difficult to get 100% uptime on, so that's something you want to also take into consideration when you allocate your CP, whether you want to get close to cap without Alkosh and run the risk of over-penetrating when Alkosh does proc, or you want to kind of sit in the middle somewhere like that. So when I say over-penetrating, that's basically when you have greater than 18,200 penetration, because just like resistances, once you go past that point, you don't get any additional benefit out of it, and that's called over-penetrating, and that leads to generally a DPS loss. So you want to get as close as you can to 18,200 without going over that amount. And now for Magicka DPS, I'm going to quickly swap over to our Magicka Sorcerer, but Magicka DPS don't have as many debuff sets to play around with when it comes to spell penetration. There's only really one set that you can use for spell penetration, and that's going to be Spinners. It's basically the Magicka version of Spriggans, and it increases your spell penetration by the same amount, 3.5k roughly. So that's the only set that you can use to increase your own spell penetration. Beyond that, there's really no other sets that you can wear to increase your spell penetration or debuff the enemy's spell resistances. The only set that will decrease the enemy's spells resistance is going to be Alkosh, and that comes from your tank, obviously. However, Magicka DPS do have an advantage in that they do have a passive that increases their spell penetration. Once I load in, I will show you where it is. It is under the light armor skill line, and it increases your penetration by, swap over to it real quick. So it's concentration and increases your spell penetration by 4,884. So that is kind of what makes up for the lack of debuff sets for Magicka DPS. You have that additional passive there. So then the other sources of your spell penetration is going to come from debuffs from various debuffs. First one's going to be Major Breach, which is basically the Magicka version of Major Fracture, reducing spell resistance by 5280. And the second one is obviously going to be Minor Breach. This, again, can only come from Power of the Light, from Templars. So that's kind of why you want to have a Stamplar in the group as much as you can. It benefits both your stamina and Magicka DPS. You can also apply Minor Breach with poisons, but that's a DPS loss in general compared to using an enchant, because using a poison does prevent you from using enchants on your weapon. And like stamina DPS, you do have a CP passive that increases your spell penetration, and that's spell erosion. And just like the piercing CP, it maxes out at 5280, and you get diminishing returns the more points you put into spell erosion. You can see here I have 35 spell points into spell erosion, and that's just how I optimize my Magicka DPS for the raid group that I run with, because we only run with Torag's Infused Crusher and we don't have Alkosh. So those are the only real sources of penetration for a Magicka DPS. So it's a lot harder to optimize for Magicka DPS because you have so many limited sources. It's usually just going to be taken into consideration. Major Breach is always going to be up. You always have your concentration passive up, unless you're doing something weird and not using 5 pieces of light armor. Then you obviously have Crusher, whether that is an infused Torag's Crusher or just a normal infused Crusher. You gotta take that into consideration. Then Alkosh, again, you have to consider uptimes on Alkosh because it's very difficult for even in a very well coordinated group to maintain 100% uptime on Alkosh. It is possible, I have seen it, but it is very difficult to do. So that's kind of how you optimize for Magicka DPS. It's a lot more how well can you maintain your debuffs up compared to stamina DPS, which is how many debuff sets do we have. So that's basically it for penetration. Please let me know down in the comments if you have any questions about how to optimize your penetration, whether it's solo purposes or for group DPS. I hope you guys found this video informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.